He wasn't speeding, he wasn't breaking the
I'm
law.
just heading
Just a
home. Why are
black
they
man
stopping
driving
me?
home after a long day, unaware that flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror were about to change everything. To the officer who stopped
He's
him,
looking at me
his
like I did
skin
something
color
wrong,
was
or
the
what is
only
this about?
crime.
I'm
What
following the
began as a
rules,
routine
but I
stop
haven't
would
done anything.
spiral into something far darker, an abuse of power fueled by prejudice. But
If
this
only
officer had no
he knew
idea who he had
who
just
I
pulled
really
over,
am.
because in minutes his actions would expose a truth that could shatter his career and shake an entire department. The question is, what happens when racism collides with power it can't control? David Harris had built his life on discipline and integrity. Every morning he rose before the sun, laced his shoes, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had overcome more than most people knew. To his colleagues in government, he was sharp, relentless, and respected. To his family, he was a provider, a mentor, a man who carried history on his shoulders with pride. But outside the walls of his office, where no titles or badges were visible, David was just another black man walking, driving, existing in a world where the color of his skin often spoke louder than his achievements. On that evening, the air was calm, the roads nearly empty, and David was simply making his way home. He wasn't thinking about work or rank, only about dinner with his wife and the promise of rest. But fate has a way of hiding storms behind still skies. Because just miles from his doorstep, flashing lights and a uniform would soon remind him and the world that no amount of status could shield him from prejudice waiting to surface. The first flash of red and blue cut through the calm like a blade. David slowed, pulled over, and waited. He knew the drill. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, no sudden gestures. But no matter how many times he reminded himself of the rules, the knot in his stomach never loosened. For too many black men, routine stops had turned into tragedies. The officer stepped out, his stride sharp, his gaze already filled with suspicion. He didn't see David's composure or his calm. He didn't see a decorated leader, a man entrusted with authority at the highest level. He saw only skin. With every step closer, the air thickened. David rolled his window down, steady but cautious. The officer leaned in, his tone laced with authority sharpened by bias. Demands were barked rather than spoken, questions framed like accusations. Why was he on this road? Where was he headed? Did he even belong in this neighborhood? David answered with quiet patience, but it didn't matter. The officer's mind was already made up. To him, David wasn't a citizen with rights. He was a threat to control, a figure to be diminished. Minutes stretched. A request for documents became an interrogation. A simple stop turned into a spectacle. The officer circling the car, hand brushing the holster of his weapon as though danger lurked in every breath David took. And David felt it. The sharp awareness that no accomplishment, no title, could shield him here. Passers-by slowed, their eyes flicking curiously toward the scene. Some glanced away, unwilling to engage. Others lingered, whispering. To them, it looked like a man under suspicion, not an officer abusing power. The weight of judgment pressed in from all sides, silent but heavy. And then it escalated. The officer ordered David out of the car. His voice cut like a whip, each word layered with hostility. David stepped out, hands visible, body still, careful not to give reason for escalation. But inside, anger and fear churned together. Why did his success, his position, his humanity vanish the moment bias entered the scene? Why did his life suddenly hang in the balance over nothing more than perception? The officer smirked, clearly enjoying the imbalance of power. He had no idea who stood before him, no idea the truth he was about to uncover. But that ignorance didn't make the moment less dangerous. Because right then, David wasn't the head of internal affairs. He was just another black man standing on the side of the road with a badge aimed against him. And in that fragile space between restraint and escalation, the story teetered. One wrong move, one misjudged breath could turn this encounter into something irreversible. The question was no longer if the officer would cross a line, but how far he was willing to go. The officer's voice cracked through the air like thunder. "Step back! Hands where I can see them!" The command wasn't about safety, it was about dominance. David froze, every muscle tense, aware that one wrong breath could tip the scale toward disaster. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from guilt, but from the raw knowledge of how fragile life could be in moments like this. The officer's hand hovered near his weapon, fingers twitching, his eyes sharp with the kind of suspicion that could turn deadly in an instant. David's pulse raced. He had trained others on accountability, led investigations that held officers to the highest standard, yet here he was, reduced to a target on the side of the road. The crowd grew thicker, whispers rising into uneasy murmurs. Phones were raised, cameras capturing every second, every injustice, every ounce of bias unfolding in real time. David felt the weight of those lenses, not as protection, but as witnesses to what could become his last moments. The officer barked another order, stepping closer, daring David to falter. Fear surged, but so did resolve. David knew who he was. He knew the truth, and soon this officer would too. The tension reached its breaking point. The line between restraint and chaos stretched to its limit. In that instant, it was no longer about one man stopped on a quiet road. It was about every injustice that came before, every life reduced to suspicion, every story silenced before it was told. And as the officer prepared to push even further, David made a choice. A single, deliberate move that would flip the balance of power and reveal a truth this officer was utterly unprepared to face. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The officer never saw it coming. The badge, the title, the authority, David's truth dropped like a hammer, shattering the false power that had controlled the moment. The smirk on the officer's face drained into shock, his authority crumbling beneath the weight of reality. David wasn't a man to be dismissed, demeaned, or erased. He was the head of internal affairs, the very person tasked with holding officers accountable for their actions. But even with the tables turned, the damage lingered. Because for David, it wasn't about proving who he was. It was about the terrifying truth that without his position, without the shield of his title, this encounter could have ended very differently. The humiliation, the fear, the knowledge that his life had dangled by a thread, all because of skin color, left scars far deeper than the moment itself. And yet, this was not just David's story. It is the story of countless others, names we know and names we never will. Men, women, and children who didn't have the power to reveal a title that could shift the outcome. Stories that ended not with justice, but with silence. As David drove away that night, the flashing lights fading in his rearview mirror, one question echoed louder than the sirens. How many more lives must be shaken, humiliated, or lost before the system changes? This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a mirror reflecting the reality too many still face, a reality we cannot ignore. So I ask you, how many more stories like David's must be told before we finally say enough?